From our BizVision studios in the UK, you're watching the BBTV Today's Leader channel. Now, you don't have to watch TV or read media for too long before you see the words planet and climate rearing their head, especially regards to resource extraction. But do we really understand it all, or are we just nodding our heads for fear of either appearing ignorant or standing out from the crowd? You see, it's my belief that the world needs resource extraction, such as silver and such as gold, for many ethical reasons. My guest today has a very impressive career in both mining and business advisory, so is extremely well qualified to, let's call it, both inform and educate, so that we get a balanced understanding. Let's go say hello to Howard Crosby. Welcome, Howard.
Malcolm, yes, great to be here. Excited to have a chat with you about these interesting topics.
Yeah, and you're in Washington State. But before we do that, I want to tell our viewers and listeners something I've just found out about, and I should have known. You have quite a famous uncle, don't you?
Yeah, I think he was probably the most famous entertainer of the 20th century, is singer, movie star Bing Crosby.
Wow.
He was my dad's younger brother by a few months. They were pretty much Irish twins.
And I believe that you actually challenged him to golf as well, did you?
Oh, yeah. I played quite a bit of golf with Uncle Bing. I was a college golfer and played on a college golf scholarship. And he enjoyed playing with me because I could hit the ball. I was a young guy and could hit the ball a long ways. And we had a lot of fun on the golf course.
All right. And go on and tell me, did you win?
Well, by then he was a very fine player. I don't know if you knew this, but he played in the U.S. Amateur in 1940. He qualified for the British Amateur in 1950 or 51 and played at the Old Course. And the last time they had the Open at the Old Course, I happened to be watching on ESPN on the Friday, and they had Peter Allis guest commentating from the BBC on ESPN. Henrik Stenson birdied the first three holes, and Peter Allis said, "I remember in the amateur in 1950, a fellow named Bing Crosby birdied the first three holes to take a lead in his match, but he ended up losing one down to an electrician from Lancashire." And he said there were probably 12,000 people in the gallery that day following the matches, and 11,900 of them were following that particular match.
Right. Yeah. I come from a place only 50 miles away, Carlisle in Cumbria, where Bing used to love going every year across to Cockermouth and go fishing at the Trout Hotel. So it's a small world. Howard, thanks for kindly coming to guest on BBTV, especially on our flagship channel, Today's Leader, where our aim is to inform, educate, and thought lead. In this talk show, viewers and listeners, I'll be chatting to Howard in three parts. The first part, we'll talk about about the world of natural resource extraction today and why it seems to get such a bad write-up. In part two, we'll talk about how we need to see the alignment of mining with the world's future and what part it plays in it. And that's not just financially. And in part three, I'm asking Howard, away from mining, but using his vast experience and knowledge, how can we achieve a world without inflation? What's a stable money environment? And what's it like to live in one? But Howard, before we move into our three parts, can you briefly tell us who the normal Howard Crosby is and why your passion for mining?
Well, thanks, Malcolm. I've been at this for a long time. I started my career way back in the early 80s with United Nuclear. As a young man, we were in the uranium mining business, and I got my baptism there. And then I moved on from there into becoming a project developer on all kinds of different minerals, but especially a big fascination with silver. And I can get into a lot more detail on that later on. In the early part of the new century, my partner and I bought the Mesquite mine from Newmont and redeveloped it and ended up selling it on to some Barrick executives. It's now a major flagship operation for Equinox, producing 175,000 ounces of gold per annum. We did a play on a uranium project during the mini boom in 2004. It took a company public called High Plains Uranium, which was successfully sold to another uranium player. And then in 2006, we bought the second largest primary silver mine in U.S. history, called the Galena, from Coeur d'Alene Mines. They were ready to shut it down. We redeveloped it, quintupled the reserves, put it back in operation, and it's currently continuing to operate at full production of 2.5 million ounces of silver a year in the Coeur d'Alene Mining District, which is the premier silver district in the United States. And then more recently, we've been involved in a number of other projects, including Gold Express Mines, which is on the logo here. That's a project that John and I started up about a year ago to acquire as many interesting precious metal exploration and development opportunities as we could across the Western United States, with a belief that with the unbridled and unparalleled money printing that's going on by the Federal Reserve and other central banks around the world, that we've baked in an awful lot of currency devaluation and inflation, which is now probably inescapable.
Wow, what a career. Howard, let's jump straight into part one, and let's talk about the world of natural resource extraction. I hope I've got that phraseology right there. Natural resource extraction today, and why it seems to get such a bad write-up. After all, we need it, don't we?
Well, certainly. I mean, it's amazing to me the naivete of a lot of members of the general public. Essentially, everything that you ever see in your life was either grown by a farmer or mined by a miner. Every single thing in your room came from the earth, one way or another. And it's inescapable. So if you start looking at some of the transitions that are envisioned in the coming years to a more electric-based economy, I mean, you have to ask yourself a lot of questions. But first and foremost, what's going to generate the electricity to power all these devices that we have? If you look at the revolution in electrification of transport, electric vehicles, I think most of your viewers would be surprised to realize that an electric car requires somewhere between 4 and 6 times the amount of copper as a conventional car.
Wow.
In addition, there's substantial amounts of other elements that need to be mined. For instance, the current basis for the batteries in an electric vehicle is the lithium-ion battery, which requires substantial amounts of lithium, which are typically mined from lithium salt deposits. And I think the number I saw, it takes 500,000 gallons of water to produce 1 ton of lithium. So lithium extraction is very difficult on water supplies, particularly since lithium is often found in desert areas like the Atacama in Chile or Western Nevada in the United States, or High Plateau in Bolivia. So there's those kinds of issues. And the other thing that's the conventional batteries that are currently used in like the Teslas, for instance, require a substantial amount of cobalt, and 50% of the world's cobalt comes from the Congo. Most of the rest of it comes from places in the former Soviet Union, and a substantial portion of the cobalt that's produced in the Congo is produced in appalling conditions by child labor. I think very few people that buy Teslas are aware that they're subsidizing child labor in the Congo. But the Tesla won't run without cobalt to make the battery. So there's a lot of developments in new battery technologies that are being developed. Zinc batteries that are based on zinc, or zinc nickel batteries. I think Elon Musk went on record as saying that he's encouraging the world's miners to find more nickel, because if they're going to transition away from lithium batteries, they're going to have a lot of nickel. And there haven't been any big new nickel discoveries in probably two decades since Voisey's Bay, maybe. So, and we went through a long down cycle as well, Malcolm, in between 2011 and 2019, where there weren't a lot of new big projects being discovered or developed. And so a lot of the big copper mines, Chile produces 40% of the world's copper. It's the Saudi Arabia of copper, but most of the big mines in Chile are pretty long in the tooth. Their ore grades are declining, their output is declining, and there haven't been a lot of giant new discoveries of major copper mines. So if we're going to transition into the kind of electrification that people envision, we're going to need an awful lot of copper.
Yeah. And I was chatting to a gentleman the other day who busy mining graphite from Madagascar, again, because of electrification. It really is fascinating how that you're really at the front of what is such a necessary, and I suggest to viewers and listeners, get a grip on understanding. Howard, before we move to part 2, I'd just like to remind my viewers and listeners of your website URL, which viewers you can see on the screen behind me, which is goldexpressmines.com. But for listeners, let me read that out to you again. Goldexpressmines.com, goldexpressmines.com. Howard, before we move to part two, let's talk about how we need to see the alignment of mining with the world's future. You just kindly given us some indication of what part it plays in it. And it's not just financially, is it?
Oh, no. I mean, for instance, if we talk just a little bit about silver, which is probably my primary area of expertise.
Yeah.
Silver is such an essential commodity in so many things that people are unaware of. For instance, well, if we go back 20 years in history, at that time, about 50% of industrial demand for silver was for photographic film. And with the advent of digital imaging, virtually 97% of the demand for silver and photographic film has been wiped out. Mm-hmm. What's interesting, though, is that hundreds of additional applications for industrial silver have developed since then, to the extent that there's now greater demand for industrial silver than there was back when it was being used for film. But unlike the era when we were processing silver-based film, where the film processors were pretty good at recycling some of that silver as they process the film, now you have tiny amounts of silver that are essential in all kinds of things. For instance, that smartphone that your viewers are holding on to has a little tiny bit of silver in it that's required to make it run. So does your plasma TV, so does your water purification systems, a lot of your bactericides, all kinds of other industrial applications where the tiny amount of silver that's in there is essential, but will not drive the ultimate cost of the device, nor will it probably ever get recycled when that device is disposed of. So this puts increasing pressure on the demand for mining new sources of silver. And the other thing that's interesting is 80% of all silver demand, or silver production rather, comes from byproduct of other metals. So silver is more inelastic to price than any other commodity that I know of. Because if you're mining a zinc mine, you're producing a amount of silver as a byproduct, you're not going to increase your production just because the price of silver went up a little bit. Mm-hmm. Conversely, and I can speak with some authority on this because we did own and operate for a time the second largest primary silver mine in the United States. It's completely counterintuitive that at a time when silver prices take a big jump, you would think that primary silver producers would produce more silver to capitalize on the higher price.
Yep.
That's not actually what happens. What actually happens is when the price takes a big jump, your primary silver mines will mine portions of the ore body that are sub-economic at lower prices to extend the mine life. So they may actually produce fewer ounces of silver during periods of high demand and high prices.
Does that happen with gold as well, by the way?
Not so much with gold. No, gold is a pure monetary metal. Right. I tell people, one of my favorite lines, Malcolm, is people say, well, what do you think of the price of gold? I say, well, gold doesn't have a price. Gold is money. Gold has an exchange rate. You wouldn't ask me what's the price of a euro. You wouldn't ask me what's the price of a yen. What do I think of the price of a yen? You'd say, what do you think of the exchange rate?
Right.
Gold's only function is to function as money in one form or another. I mean, in some cultures like India, they buy gold as jewelry and they hold it as savings effectively. But it's always primary function is to function as money. That's why central banks buy gold. That's why the Chinese government buys 100% of all the gold that's produced in country, and they're now the largest single producer of gold.
Right.
Every ounce is purchased by the Chinese central bank. And central banks around the world historically hold gold in their reserves because gold is money. Gold is the only money that is not someone else's liability. The US dollar is a liability of the US government.
Yeah.
Euro is a liability of the European Union, but gold is nobody's liability. It's a pure monetary asset.
Fascinating. Let me just talk to you about the concern that people do have about resource extraction. And you hit upon yes, there's pollution. I understand that, and that's one area to be cleared. But you did hit upon something that's extremely prominent at the moment, and that's slave labor. And
responsible Western mining companies in Europe and the United States and Canada and elsewhere have made huge strides in terms of more sustainable resource extraction. And mining projects now typically, they take some time to permit, and they require bonding for reclamation, and they're very extensively studied, and to assure that the extraction can be done in a responsible way.
Right.
If you get into places like the Congo in the third world, this is where resource extraction continues to be very potentially environmentally degrading. But not so much for projects coming out of countries like the United Kingdom or the United States or Australia or Canada. We have to follow pretty stringent environmental regulations and requirements, and bonding requirements for reclamation and so forth.
So is it improving, our perception of the slave labor and the pollution? Is it improving?
That's a very good question, Malcolm, and I don't really know how to answer that. I mean, there is the NGOs and the third-party environmental concerns have massive amounts of funding, and they produce an awful lot of distortion in terms of what's out there without ever educating the public into the absolute necessity of resource extraction if we're to have 21st century life.
Yeah.
I mean, the other thing is, if you get into like the hydrocarbons, it's become a big thing now that we're not gonna produce fossil fuels, right? Well, if you don't produce natural gas, the planet's going to starve. I mean, if we go back to the beginning of the 20th century, 95% of the United States workforce was engaged in subsistence farming. Today, it's less than 2.5% of Americans work as farmers, and they produce hundreds of times the output of agricultural output that we had in 1900.
Yeah.
Well, how do they do that? Well, they do that because they have diesel-powered tractors, combines, and farm equipment, and they have natural gas-based fertilizer that allows them to expand production 100-fold over where they could do it with manure and handheld plows and horse-drawn plows. And it's all a function of the economy that's based on fossil fuels.
Yeah, I really appreciate that you kindly coming in to get that balanced view, because I've always felt for some time that we were being not getting seeing the other side, as you have kindly done so. Howard, now for part 3, I'm asking you, and I know it's away from mining, but I want to use your vast knowledge and experience. How can we achieve a world without inflation? What is a stable money environment, and what's it like to live in one?
Well, the best example I can give you is from your own country now.
Yeah.
Because from the early part of the 18th century until the outbreak of World War I, Britain had a virtuous cycle of stable money based on gold and ever increasing productivity, so that over time, prices of goods and services gently dropped as productivity increased output and the money remained stable. You may not be aware that for over 200 years, the Postal Service in Britain embossed the price of a first-class stamp on brass plaques in the post office because it never changed.
Right.
I believe it was 2 shillings.
Yeah.
To mail a first-class postage letter in the United Kingdom. Now, if you think about what's gone on in the last few decades here in the United States, and I'm sure Britain and elsewhere, our current chairman of the Federal Reserve, Mr. Powell, and before him, Janet Yellen, and before that, Bernanke, and before that, Greenspan, they always talk about they're going to target 2% inflation, which I find remarkable amount of hubris, because essentially what they're telling us is that their target is to steal 2% of everybody's money every year.
Yeah.
And this is going to affect the poorest people in society the hardest.
Yeah.
I mean, a wealthy person can probably withstand having 2% of his money stolen by inflation every year. And of course, the stated inflation rate is clearly bogus. Anybody that goes to the grocery store or buys petrol or anything else can tell you that prices are rising a lot faster than what they state they will rise. Now, let me just diverge for a minute, if I can, on this topic to the subject of minimum wage, because this has been a big discussion in the United States about increasing the minimum wage from most states, it's somewhere around $7.50 or $8 an hour, and there's a lot of advocating going to $15 an hour. So let's spin back a few decades to 1963. Okay.
Right. Yeah.
At that time, the minimum wage was $1.25 an hour.
Mm-hmm.
That was represented by 5 quarters, five silver, 90% silver quarters.
Right.
So if today you were paid 5 silver quarters an hour, you would be making the equivalent of about $25 an hour. So it's not that the minimum wage hasn't kept pace, it's that the money has been debased through inflation and fiat money. Another good example, in 1963, if you had 3 silver dimes, you could buy a gallon of gasoline for 30 cents. Okay?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
In 2021, if you have those same 3 silver dimes and you cash them in for the silver value, you can buy about 2.5 gallons of petrol.
Right.
But if you have 3 1964 silver dimes, which were no longer made of silver, in 1964, they would buy you a gallon of gas, those 3 zinc-clad dimes. Today, they won't even buy you 1/10 of a gallon of gas because of inflation and the destruction of the currency. So the only way you can get to stable money is you have to have a system where there's an absolute irredeemable fix of the currency to a precious metal backing, either gold or gold and silver. You know, we had bimetallism in the United States for a long time, where both gold and silver functioned as money. And in fact, if you read the Constitution of the United States Treasury is only allowed to issue gold and silver as money. The founding fathers of this republic knew, because they'd had the experience of massive inflation during the era of between the end of the American Revolution and the founding of the republic, during the period of the Articles of Confederation, with runaway inflation through fiat money. They knew what would happen if you didn't back your money with precious metals. So what happened in 1913, the Federal Reserve was formed. People think the Federal Reserve is part of the US government, but it's not. It's owned by member banks from around the world, and they're somehow granted a license to print fiat money, which is what's causing all the problems that we have now with a world without stable money. And it's really kind of the first time in history, really, where all governments across the world are engaged in rampant inflation, which of course is defined as an increase in the quantity of money.
But it's not right. So are you saying in a roundabout way as well, that we as the general public are suffering from profiteering or somebody wanting to take advantage of control?
Yes, politicians hate the gold standard because it doesn't allow them to buy votes with printed money. They always have. There's a discipline associated if you have to have, you know, an actual precious metal backing for the currency.
Yeah.
And absent that, the temptation for politicians of all stripes is to inflate and to spend money that we don't have on things that sound nice, but really in the end is an inflationary destruction of the currency worth it? I mean, there was a wonderful book that was written, I just reread it here a few months ago, called When Money Dies. It was about the hyperinflation in Germany in the end of the First World War. And most people don't realize, Malcolm, how quickly money can die.
Yeah.
In an inflationary spiral.
Yeah.
And I want to get these numbers right. I think they'll be pretty close anyway. At the end of World War I, you know, Germany had a lot of debt. And that, of course, they were burdened with war reparations and other things by the Treaty of Versailles. So the inflation rate at the end of the war in Germany was running about 3%. By 1922, by the end of 1922, December 1922, the inflation rate in Germany was running at about 22%. By September of 1923, so 9 months later, it was running at 33,000%. We're printing trillion mark notes on one side of the paper only to save ink. It's astonishing how fast, when the inflation really gets out of control, how fast it can end. Yeah.
I was just thinking there as you were talking, reflecting back to when I first started work at the end of the 1960s, and I was paid the princely sum of £1,000 a year £1,000.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and now some people spend that on a meal in London.
Well, and
when the rest,
back in those days, I think, what was the exchange rate with the pound? It was about $5 to the pound back then, I
yeah,
believe.
yeah, and as you quite rightly, it's a very incredible thought that we're having our money stolen from us. I said at the start of this interview that our Today's Leaders channel aims to inform, educate, and help you have a balanced view. We can only do that by having guests of the true caliber of Howard Crosby. Thank you, Howard.
Thank you, Malcolm. It's been my pleasure. I'll be looking forward to my next trip to London once we get through this thing that we're all dealing with.
Yeah, we'll have to have a drink in the silver goblet.
I'll be all for that.